Thank you for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Efrem Graham. Ahead today, after the recent mass shootings, a call to action on guns. President Biden saying Congress must do something amid growing gun violence.
Over the last 2 decades, more school-age children have died from guns than on-duty police officers and active-duty military combined.
Will a bipartisan group of senators come up with a bill both sides can agree on? An historic event in the Middle East as Israel signs its first trade agreement with an Arab nation.
It will be an inspiration to the countries that are watching about the things that are possible.
How Israel and Middle Eastern countries are already reaping the benefits. A round of suicides on Navy aircraft carrier. What was behind them? And one Navy chaplain tells CBN News about a spiritual answer to this tragedy. And on the anniversary of a Billy Graham crusade in South Korea, prayer warriors from that country coming to the United States to pray for America. All those stories and more today on CBN NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We want to begin with the political debates and battles in Washington over what to do about gun violence. The president addressing the nation last night saying the Second Amendment is, quote, not absolute, but adding this is not about taking away anyone's guns. On Capitol Hill, members from both parties working on ideas to protect Americans and hoping for a compromise. Brody Carter has our report.
The CDC says gun violence is the #1 killer of children in the United States. More so than car accidents and cancer. After the most recent deadly mass shootings, Democrats are poised to pass laws to try and stop the violence.
Over the last 2 decades, more school-age children have died from guns than on-duty police officers and active-duty military combined.
The U.S. has seen more mass shootings than the number of days so far this year. Gun violence is being called an epidemic.
The question now is, what will the Congress do? The House of Representatives already passed key measures we need.
President Biden presented a number of goals, including a ban on assault rifles and high-capacity magazines, strengthening background checks and red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of mentally disturbed people. This after 3 mass shootings in 17 days, leaving 35 people dead. 10 in Buffalo, New York, when a man targeted black people in a grocery store. 4 in Tulsa, when a disgruntled patient came after his surgeon at a medical facility, and 21 in Texas, including 19 school children, when the gunman attacked an elementary school.
Imagine being that little girl, that brave little girl in Uvalde, who smeared blood off her murdered friend's body on her own face to lie still among the corpses in her classroom and pretend she was dead in order to stay alive.
House Democrats launched a bill Thursday. The Protecting Our Kids Act would raise the age to buy assault-style weapons to 21, restrict high-capacity magazines, ban ghost guns or guns made at home, and seek new penalties for gun trafficking.
This bill will not alone save every life we will lose to gun violence this year, but it will save some. It might have saved those children in Uvalde, and whoever saves one life, it says if he saved the entire world. The American people are begging for us to address this crisis.
Senate Republicans say solutions go beyond limiting access to guns.
Anyone with any heartbeat is horrified that 19 little boys and girls were murdered, that 2 teachers were murdered. And what does Joe Biden and the Democrats do? They don't come back and say, let's unite behind law enforcement to stop criminals, to keep our kids safe. No, they immediately demagogue and say the solution is to take away your weapons. The solution is to disarm law-abiding citizens.
Meanwhile, a bipartisan group of senators is working together with a focus on school safety and mental health. Mitch McConnell expects to have something to present next week. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Coming up, a closer look at an historic event in the Middle East this week. For the first time, Israel signed a free trade agreement with an Arab nation. We're going to tell you about the amazing implications of this deal right after this. Israel has entered into its first free trade agreement with an Arab nation. It was signed Tuesday and is a direct result of the Abraham Accords. As CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reports, Israel and the Gulf states are already reaping benefits.
Described as comprehensive and groundbreaking, Israel and the United Arab Emirates signed the historic free trade zone deal in Dubai.
I'm certain that this is not only about developing opportunities in the business community and initiatives in developing new technology in Israel, but also in the Emirates. It will be an inspiration to the countries that are watching about the things that are possible.
UAE Industry and Advanced Technology Minister Dr. Sultan bin Ahmed Al Jaber sees the agreement creating a new paradigm for the region. Our agreement can prove to countries and governments around the world that cooperation and dialogue are the best way to transform challenges into opportunities. Negotiated over about 6 months, the two countries are expected to increase bilateral trade in goods and services.
I don't think ever in history a free trade agreement was negotiated as quickly and as efficiently as this one was. Usually free trade agreements are reserved for a country's best friends, and they usually take years to process.
John Medved, CEO of Our Crowd, an online global investing platform, says he saw a positive impact before the agreement was even signed.
Last quarter, there was $1 billion of trade in the quarter. Since the accords have been signed, it was $2.5 billion in mutual trade.
Signed in September 2020, the Abraham Accords initially involved Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. Morocco and Sudan joined later. Dr. Sabah al-Binali, executive chairman of Our Crowd Arabia, says the deal will take the two markets beyond imports and exports. Al-Binali says the idea is expand, not replace current trade partners.
Once we see companies that have shareholders and executives that are both Israeli and Emirati working together to look at both business models, geographies, and so on.
Amid the progress, one of the prevailing questions is whether Saudi Arabia will come on board.
The Saudis are very, very much a tech-embracing society. They have been very active investors in venture capital globally. They are some of the smartest investors in the world. They want job creation in terms of technology jobs.
In the meantime, the Abraham Accord countries are moving ahead at an historic pace for the region.
And Chris Mitchell joins us now from Jerusalem. Chris, you just returned from a trip to the UAE and Bahrain. What did you learn on your visit?
Well, Ephraim, I would say we learned that, this free trade agreement really wasn't that much of a surprise. The accords are going strong. They're standing the test of time, and they're held together by common interest. And right now you see this free trade agreement. Trade is one of the biggest things that's keeping them together. Tourism is another thing that's tying the United Arab Emirates and Israel together. And also, it's the threat of Iran. We heard that in the UAE. We heard that in Bahrain. To give you an example, the Bahraini Interior Minister told us that the three top threats to Bahrain were Iran, Iran, and Iran. But we're also seeing, and what we heard, Ephraim, is it's actually people-to-people relationships are growing right now. One leader told us off the record it was sort of like cousins getting to know one another.
Now, do you expect Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, I do, Ephraim. I think that, if the Trump administration was still in power, I think a lot of people, and that's exactly what we were hearing with many of the leaders in Bahrain and the UAE, that it would have gone much further and there would have been many other nations joining the Abraham Accords. Now, they didn't mention Saudi Arabia specifically. But I think that would have been one of the nations that might have already been under the Abraham Accords by now. Now there's a different and somewhat troubled relationship under the Biden administration. They had a rocky start. For example, the Biden administration took the Houthis, which is an arch enemy of Saudi Arabia, off the foreign terrorist organization list. And that's one thing that really hurt that relationship. Now the U.S. needs the oil, and that's why it looks like President Biden is going to be transacting that, may even visit there. We'll see. But that was something that we think that the Saudi Arabia is going to eventually open up to the Abraham Accords.
All right, we'll be watching that for sure. Stay with us, Chris. We have a second story from you about another important event in Israel this week as hundreds of Jews and Christians gathered in Jerusalem for the 6th annual Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. The gathering follows the biblical command to pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Delegates from around the world came to Jerusalem to pray.
This is our 6th year being here, and it's very simple. We're trying to fulfill the commandment when God says to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And so we invite people from all over the world, members of parliament, members of Congress, to come here and be a part of this, but also people who just love Israel.
This year, Nick Vujicic of Life Without Limbs Ministry came to the breakfast for the first time.
The revelation and magnitude of that really is that from all people of all nations and all tongues who do believe in the Bible, we know the importance, so much so that we made sure that we are here to do a Jerusalem prayer breakfast in Jerusalem. We know how important this is. We know how close Israel is close to God's heart.
Since it began in 2017, the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast has grown dramatically, and it's been held in 15 nations, from Dallas in the U.S. and Rome in Europe to Ghana in Africa.
I think the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast is the call of God for the nations to align with Jerusalem as the footstool of God's throne on the earth, to recognize that his government is above every other government, and he's calling on them now to align their government properly.
I mean, coming here is just very powerful and a blessing. The spirit and the certainty and affirmation that this is the land and this is what God wants, for us to all come together to be able to bring peace to the world.
Through prayers, we can change things, we can change history, and we can ask God to do his will on earth. And also because it's written in all the Bible that we should pray for the peace of Israel and for the peace of Jerusalem.
Chris, some of the organizers of the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast say they've seen miracles as a result of their prayers. What are they referring to?
Well, one thing they mention, Ephraim, is the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Back when they were here in 2017, they prayed that the U.S. would recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. 6 months to the day, December 6, 2017, President Trump did recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish state. And then after that, the next year, they moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. A lot of people, when that initial prayer came to pass, they weren't sure it's going to happen, but it did. And they just see a fulfillment in the nations that bless Israel, just like Genesis 12 does say that those that bless Israel would be blessed. And also the promise in Psalm 122, verse 6, that those that pray for the peace of Jerusalem will prosper. So in general, when they see nations do that, they see a blessing.
All right, our CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell from Jerusalem. Chris, thank you as always. I want to remind you at home that you can see more news from the Middle East with Chris and our CBN News team in Israel on Jerusalem Dateline on the CBN News channel tonight at 8:30 Eastern. You can also see it on the CBN News app. Still ahead, a wave of suicides on an aircraft carrier. Parents of the victims say the awful living conditions are to blame, but there is hope from a spiritual source. We're going to have more about that next. Awful living conditions. That's how one sailor described life aboard an aircraft carrier right here in Virginia. He's one of 3 sailors serving on the carrier who died recently from apparent suicides. 4 others have also been reported in the last few years. The service launched investigations, and a Navy chaplain tells medical reporter Lori Johnson what people of faith can do now to help.
The unusual string of suicides happened while the aircraft carrier USS George Washington was docked in Virginia undergoing extended maintenance. As the Navy investigates the deaths, it's offering increased mental health services to those working aboard the ship during its lengthy overhaul.
Sailors are now being allowed to live elsewhere, such as Navy barracks, rather than being confined to the ship during this maintenance that's been going on almost 5 years. That extended time is believed to be part of the reason that led 6, possibly 7 sailors to commit suicide in the last 2 years. 3 happened in the course of 1 week last month, including 19-year-old Xavier Sander.
It was a construction site, and he worked 12-hour shifts at night. So he couldn't sleep during the day on the ship.
His parents recalled their son describing cramped, hot, noisy living conditions.
We are always, Xavier, it'll get better, not knowing really what the conditions really were. It's going to haunt me for the rest of my life.
Natalie and Lamont are also grieving the loss of their son, Mikhail Sharp.
All I can constantly think about is when he was born, his smile.
After touring the carrier, Virginia Representative and Navy veteran Elaine Luria described many of the sailors as being new to the Navy and quite isolated. She wants information about possible leadership issues and whether the sailors were provided adequate mental health services.
The sailors are going through a really tough time because of these losses, especially sailors who had a personal connection to those who were lost recently. I think as far as command climate is concerned, I have concerns about some things on the ship, but I didn't see any, large red flags.
The U.S. Navy issued a statement saying the circumstances surrounding these incidents vary and it's premature to make assumptions as some incidents remain under investigation. In addressing the deaths, the commander of the Atlantic Naval Air Forces said prolonged ship maintenance can be more difficult than most assignments, especially for newcomers.
But that's clearly our most at-risk population in terms of how they adapt to military life, how they onboard to a command, how they process into a ship that's in a shipyard. Without doubt, more challenging for sailors to come into this kind of environment than others.
Calling the recent suicides a human tragedy, Virginia Senator Mark Warner also wants answers.
Figuring out how and why, and was this unique to the George Washington in any circumstances, or is this an even much larger issue across the Navy writ large, is something I think we're all committed to finding out.
The Navy's top enlisted leader telling the GW crew after the suicides there is indeed a problem.
I understand that we still have a problem, and the department has been focusing on it, but the problem is getting a suicide is like getting cancer. There are many different causes, many different reasons.
Navy Chaplain Lewis Lee says now more than ever, sailors need Jesus.
The hope that we can give is the gospel message. It's Christ.
He encourages people of faith to do what they can for our military.
There's chaplains, but more so good Christian sailors who can share the gospel, or maybe somebody from their family members, maybe it's their grandmother who prays for them, who every now and then when they talk to them, they encourage them to trust in the Lord, to read the Bible or whatever it may be. I knew one sailor who would pass out tracts, and only God knows how effective that is.
Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Coming up, hundreds of prayer warriors from South Korea are visiting the United States this week. They're here to pray for America. We'll tell you why when we come back. Stay with us. You don't want to miss this story. Hundreds of intercessors from South Korea are crisscrossing America this week, praying for revival and a spiritual awakening. Their visit comes nearly 50 years after Billy Graham held a historic crusade in Seoul that led to a huge revival across South Asia. As George Thomas reports, these intercessors have simply come back to our shores to repay a debt to pray for America in her time of need.
From Bellingham, Washington to Los Angeles, to Bangor, Maine to Miami, 240 South Korean Christians have been blanketing these and 17 other cities with prayers for healing and revival to sweep America. Pastor Choi is among those who traveled from Seoul for the prayer initiative.
Just as the first missionaries from the United States came to our nation and spread the fire of the gospel, we want to bring that fire back to America.
The 21 teams of intercessors arrived in the States this week on the 49th anniversary of Billy Graham's historic 1973 crusade in Seoul, which drew more than 3 million people. 75,000 people reportedly gave their lives to Christ during Graham's 5-day crusade, leading to a huge Christian revival felt not only in South Korea, but in other parts of Asia in the years since.
Even though I was small when the crusade happened, I know millions of people's lives were impacted by that event and eventually led to the explosion of the church movement in South Korea.
Now, the grandchildren of that revival in South Korea have returned to our shores to pay back what they say is a spiritual debt to America.
They know that America is in trouble, and America has stood with them, and they want to stand with America in this time that America is in spiritual trouble, and simply praying for a third great awakening in this nation.
Pastor Evanson's church in Newport News, Virginia, is hosting 10 South Korean intercessors. He took them to several important sites this week, including Cape Henry, where English settlers planted a cross and prophesied that the gospel would go forth from these shores to all the nations. The intercessors stood at the foot of the cross, praying that God would fulfill this covenant promise in this generation. On Saturday, all 240 South Korean intercessors will join local congregations in March for Jesus rallies across those 21 cities. George Thomas, CBN News, Jamestown, Virginia.
Time now for your Friday Faithful. As we prepare to remember and celebrate Pentecost Sunday this weekend, I want to remind you, God is faithful. He promised us a comforter, and He delivered. His name is Holy Spirit, and He is with us always to guide, to comfort, and to equip. With that word, be sure you make this day a fabulous Friday and have yourself a wonderful weekend as well. That's going to do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. You can always find more of our programs on the CBN News channel. You can find them there at any time as well as online, cbnnews.com. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today. You can email us. That address is right there at the bottom of your screen, newswatch@cbn.com. And of course, you can always reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We would love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you right back here, same time Monday. Goodbye, God bless.